Hey, folks, quick note before we get started. Our conversation today is a special one. Every year at the Next Big Idea Club, we pick the 6 most important books, the ones we think everyone will be talking about, and we send early copies to our members with a personal note from the author. Our first selection of 2026 is A World Appears, A Journey into Consciousness by the one and only Michael Pollan, who's our guest today. If you'd like to get an early copy of the book and join our live conversation with Michael on March 10th, please join us. We'd love to see you there. Just go to nextbigideaclub.com. I'm Rufus Griscom.
And I'm Caleb Bissinger.
And this is The Next Big Idea. Today, Michael Pollan takes us on a journey into consciousness. One night in 1998, 2 men made a bet at a bar.
But this wasn't your usual bar bet, because these were unusual men.
One of them was David Chalmers, an Australian philosopher best known for coining the hard problem of consciousness. How is it, he asked, that a few pounds of gray matter between our ears gives rise to thoughts, feelings, and sensations? It was a question he believed scientists lacked the tools to answer.
His drinking partner, a German neuroscientist named Christoph Koch, he disagreed. So he bet Chalmers a case of wine that within 25 years, scientists would find the physical footprint, the neural correlates of consciousness in the brain.
25 years later, they met on stage in New York City.
Oh my God, it's a case of wine.
I can see that loss.
You lost. Well, okay.
However, I'm going to double down and I'll challenge you in 25 years from now, Dave.
Hang on.
In 25 years, we will have achieved clarity.
Look, I hope I lose. It will be fantastic if we know the neural correlates of consciousness within 25 years. I suspect I'll win, but we'll see.
That story opens the latest book by the incomparable Michael Pollan. A case can be made that Michael Pollan is the most influential science journalist in the world. 20 years ago, I read his first bestseller, The Botany of Desire, which described the coevolution of humans and plants from the plant's perspective. It was a beautiful book that left a real mark on me. That was followed by The Omnivore's Dilemma in 2006 that changed the way that I thought about nutrition and how I ate, and How to Change Your Mind about the history and promising applications of psychedelic drugs and Michael's own experiences with them. His new book, A World Appears, A Journey into Consciousness, may be his most ambitious work yet. The Financial Times described it as a big, generous, illuminating, and beautifully written inquiry into the essence of our being in the world, of being simply alive.
Michael conceived of this book as a detective story,
where I went looking for the answer to a question, which is, how does 3 pounds of brain matter generate subjective experience?
Like Christoph Koch before him, his hopes were dashed.
We're nowhere near answering that question.
But that didn't stop him from writing a fascinating book about all the questions we have answered, all that we've learned about human, animal, and even plant consciousness.
And about the tantalizing possibility that a new form of consciousness is emerging on silicon, which is to say, in artificial intelligence.
Michael's not convinced.
The whole idea right now of AI becoming conscious is based on a metaphor that the brain is a computer. And that metaphor breaks down really quickly if you think hard about it.
But he hasn't closed the door on the possibility either.
I think the next few decades is going to see a profound reevaluation of what the human is.
Michael Pollan went looking for the answer to the biggest mystery in the world. What he found might be even more interesting after the break. Today's episode of The Next Big Idea is sponsored by Factor, Bitdefender, and Shopify. Head to factormeals.com/idea50off and use code IDEA50off to get 50% off your first Factor box plus free breakfast for a year. Shopify gives you everything you need to sell online and in person. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/NBI. Bitdefender, a global leader in cybersecurity. Keep your small business safe with Bitdefender Ultimate Small Business Security. Save 30% when you go to bitdefender.com/idea. This winter, I've made a resolution to make healthy, fresh soups. Kale, chickpea, Thai red lentil. I go to the grocery store, I buy the ingredients, and it just doesn't happen. I'm too darn busy. Then I discovered Factor, healthy, delicious food made by chefs, designed by dietitians. You heat it for 2 minutes and eat. What's inside? Lean proteins, colorful vegetables, whole food ingredients, healthy fats. The stuff I'd make if I had the time. No refined sugars, no artificial sweeteners, always fresh, never frozen. What's incredible about Factor is the range of choices, all delicious. 100 rotating meals every week. You pick what fits your goals. Healthier eating, calorie management, more protein, whatever you're actually trying to do. I'm enjoying Factor meals, and I would heartily encourage you to give it a try. Head to factormeals.com/idea50off and use code IDEA50OFF to get 50% off your first Factor box plus free breakfast for 1 year. Offer only valid for new Factor customers with code and qualifying auto-renewing subscription purchase. Make healthier eating easy with Factor. Michael Pollan, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Thank you, Rufus. Very good to be here.
Michael, you really picked a doozy of a topic this time around. You tell us in the early pages of A World Appears that consciousness is one of the 3 biggest mysteries in the universe, alongside the questions, why is there something rather than nothing? And how did life arise from dead matter? Did you know what you were getting into?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I had heard about the hard problem, so I knew it wasn't easy, but I had no idea how complicated this was and what I had to learn to navigate this landscape. I mean, I had to learn a lot about neuroscience. I had to learn a lot about philosophy of mind, plants and their capabilities. So it was a pretty deep dive, and it took more than 5 years. But, this is what I like about what I do as a journalist. We get paid as adults to learn whole new subjects. That is an amazing privilege.
It sure is.
But yeah, there were many moments where I thought this was a hole I would never dig myself out of. I was down deep. And you could talk to my wife and she'll tell you that there were moments of utter despair, partly because I approached it in the classic Western male framework of problem solution. That it was a detective story where I went looking for the answer to a question, which is, how does 3 pounds of brain matter, which I assume was this origin of consciousness, generate subjective experience? And it took me a long time to realize that we're nowhere near answering that question. There are a lot of other questions about consciousness we can answer or explore, but the big one that I was hoping would be the pot of gold at the end of this rainbow is empty so far.
And you point out that there's an inherent problem, which is the only tool we can use to crack this nut of trying to figure out consciousness is consciousness itself.
Yeah, we're in this kind of labyrinth in that we don't think of the scientific enterprise as a manifestation of human consciousness, but of course that's what it is. We decide what to study. We design the tools to study it with. So we are using consciousness to understand consciousness. We can't attain a perspective outside of it where we could look down on it from a God's eye view.
Happily, the process of trying to answer these questions happens to be deeply engaging. And one thing I've gotten from all of your books, starting with Botany of Desire, is this sense of wonder and fascination with the process of trying to figure out this kind of beautiful, extraordinary world we've been born into. I'm quoting you here from the early pages. You say, consciousness delivers the bittersweet feeling tone of an autumn afternoon or the briny tang of an oyster. You want not just to have those experiences, but to understand why and how we have them. And I get the sense that at the tender age of 71, are you now, that the wide-eyed kid is still alive and well.
Yeah, wonder is a big part of it. And I did come out with a sense of awe about consciousness. It is the water we swim in, where you can go through life without thinking very much about consciousness. There are a couple phases in life, I think, where people tend to think about it a little more. Teenage years, at least for me, and then more recently. So we take it for granted. And it's funny, I'm writing about an experience that is universal, definitive, really, of our humanity in many ways. Yet people keep asking me why think about consciousness. It's like, well, it's the biggest mystery in the world.
Right.
And it's how you exist. So one of the challenges, I think, in talking to people about it is getting them to really appreciate quickly this precious phenomenon, which is going on with them all the time, that we don't know where it comes from. It's not like anything else in nature. The fact that as you're talking to me, there's a voice in your head, a monologue going on, or maybe it's a dialogue, and you're looking at me and thinking about your next question and if what I'm saying makes any sense to you and where to go from here. I mean, it's amazing that this is happening simultaneously and we never talk about it.
Well, Daniel Gilbert, the author of Stumbling on Happiness, advised you early in your consciousness journey to be wary of the desire for magic. As you say, at one point, consciousness may become our secular substitute for the soul. Do you think you're looking for magic?
I think so. I think we all are to some extent. We're all looking to transcend the material world that science tells us is everything. One of the attractions of consciousness study is that it raises real questions about that paradigm, which is to say that everything can be reduced to energy and matter, or the laws of physics. So studying consciousness takes you to the very limit of the metaphysical and scientific paradigm we have. But that point about the soul, I think, is important. I think a lot of people see consciousness as kind of a secular substitute for the soul. And the soul is a magical thing, in a sense. It's something that floats free of our bodies. It's indestructible. So I think that subliminally hidden in the whole conversation about consciousness is this idea of, is there something that might transcend our mortal form and survive death? So anyway, this takes us right to the edge. And believe me, there's a lot of loopy thinking going on around consciousness.
There sure is.
And now that I'm publishing on this already, I get lots of very weird emails saying, you really haven't considered this.
Yeah.
This is a challenge for all science journalists, is like, what do you do with fringe science? Fringe science sometimes becomes mainstream science.
That's right.
It's at the fringes that the paradigms start to get under pressure, and sometimes they topple. So ignoring it is a mistake. And a lot of what we do, I think, as journalists, especially science journalists, is try to figure out which ideas are credible and worth paying attention to, even if they're not mainstream ideas. I think that's something I struggle with. I mean, everyone I write about in this book is pretty credible, and some people would say I've been too conservative, but you could go way off the deep end.
Well, before we get into the really weird stuff, which I think is
the normal stuff is weird.
Is deeply interesting. The normal stuff's pretty weird too. Exactly. Let's begin with what I think of as the fun stuff, which is that it turns out there's a lot more consciousness in the world than we thought. Certainly a lot more than I thought before I began your book. Why don't we start with plants, with which you've had a love affair for some time, right? Some people would say actually that you've anthropomorphized plants since
I've heard that charge.
Your first book in a way that was absolutely fascinating.
I have enormous respect for plants and their capabilities.
And perhaps they do have that respect for you too. We'll get into this. But you tell us that your exalted estimation of plants no longer seemed quite so drug-addled or crazy once you really got into the science of it. Can we reasonably claim with a sound mind that the plants are sentient?
I am comfortable claiming that all living things are sentient. But let's define sentience. Some people will say sentience and consciousness are the same thing. I would argue that sentience is a more basic form of awareness of the environment that evolves into consciousness as we understand it. Sentience, I define simply as some awareness of your environment and a recognition of positive and negative changes in that environment, and the ability to respond appropriately. This is something that, bacteria have. They have chemotaxis. There are certain molecules they know are good for them, and there's certain molecules they know are toxic for them, and they operate accordingly. So I think that, there is some very basic sentience, and that consciousness I see as a complexification of sentience, or it's the way humans do sentience. There would be no value for bacteria to have self-consciousness or the ability to feel and suffer. Ditto with plants. Much more important to them to be able to manufacture really interesting molecules because they live in a world defined by biochemistry, and they can't run away. So they've focused on drug production of various kinds. So it would be chauvinistic of us to think that when we look at other animals and plants, that they would have any kind of consciousness like ours. Our consciousness is necessitated by our very complex social lives and the fact that we have these bodies and we exist in this scale of space and time. And we have the consciousness that has evolved to be most useful to us. In plants, it's different. So we have 5 senses, maybe 6. They have 20 because they need to be able to detect things about their environment that we don't really care about. They can hear. If you play the sound of a caterpillar chomping a leaf nearby, they will produce chemicals to change their flavor or poison those caterpillars. The roots can grow in the direction of pipes containing water, even if they're completely dry. So they're probably hearing the sound of that water go through those pipes. Those roots will share space with another plant that is genetically related and compete for space with a plant that's not. They can see. There are vines that will change their leaf shape to mimic the plant they're climbing up so they won't be seen. How do they see that shape? The other thing I found incredibly weird about plants is that they respond to the same anesthetics we do.
Totally mind-blowing.
So if you take something like xenon gas, which is spooky to begin with, it's a completely inert chemical that knocks us out. Like, it doesn't react chemically with us, but it nevertheless puts us out. It puts plants out too. And you have a plant that normally has movement, like a carnivorous plant, and it won't respond when that bug crosses its threshold. Or the sensitive plant, which collapses its leaves when it's touched, it won't do it. And then after a certain number of hours, they wake up again. So I'm happy to say that plants are sentient. They know where they are in space. They have that sense, and they know what's good and bad for them, and they take appropriate action. But I think that goes down much further than I thought on the tree of life, and that I did come out of this experience with much more. I mean, it sounds like animism, which has a kind of mystical side, but I do think that the world is more alive than Western science has allowed us to see.
I was amazed to read that Charles Darwin, who just only gets more impressive, I think, with age, right? I mean, he coined, I think, the first term for that spiraling of
circumnutation.
Right, amazing.
And he would spend time he was often ill. He had all sorts of ailments, and he had plants growing in his room, and he would spend hours watching them grow. That's pretty dedicated. I don't know if you watch the plant grow, but it's not that interesting.
That I think would be a great exercise for those of us afflicted with a modern attention span. I'd like to get my teenage boys to watch some plants grow. But Darwin described plants as upside down animals with brains in their roots, and he was largely right here. Right, that the root tips, which are command centers, typical plant has thousands of them. They're networked together. They communicate using like electrical and chemical signaling methods, and there's an intelligence there, which is separate from the question, is it like something to be a plant?
Yeah. I mean, that's taking consciousness to another level. And I did interview scientists who believe that it is like something to be a plant. And that point I made about sleep or anesthetic, because they also sleep according to many definitions of sleep or characteristics of sleep. If you can have 2 states of being, awake and asleep, some would argue that makes you conscious because it's like something to be awake and it's like something else to be asleep. And that was like, I read a whole philosophy paper making this case, and then I closed it and I said, oh yeah, I guess that's true. But then I thought, well, my toaster has 2 states also.
Right.
It's on or off.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's conscious. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that theory. This is not a book where I like argue forcefully for a certain point of view. I entertain many points of view I don't necessarily hold with, but I think are worth considering. There are various thought experiments in the book, but I did feel that plants were sentient after what I learned and what I saw. I also saw plant roots that navigate mazes.
Oh, that's incredible. Yeah.
You put a little bit of fertilizer in one corner of the maze, and you put a corn plant at the top, and that root will find that food, which is pretty incredible.
Totally. And they have memories. The sensitive plant that you mentioned
Can be trained.
can be trained to ignore a stressor for up to over 28 days, whereas a fruit fly has a 24-hour memory, right?
Right.
So that's and later in the book you talk about how some would see memory, and particularly autobiographical memory, which is maybe not what a plant has, but as part of the story of consciousness. And what makes all this possible and begin to make sense is the capacity that living organisms have to form networks and communicate through bioelectric fields. Cells, right? And this is, I guess, Michael Levin, who you say may be on his way to winning a Nobel Prize. Can you speak a little bit to that? Yeah.
Michael's an amazing biologist. He teaches at Tufts. He's a regenerative biologist. He looks at how living things regenerate parts that get chopped off. So he works a lot with planaria, which is a little worm that if you chop off its head, it grows a new head. Chop off its tail, it grows a new tail. He's taught them certain things, as you can do, a conditioning test, and then chopped off their heads. They regrow a head and they remember what they were taught. So the memory was not stored in their brains, which got lopped off. The memory was stored in what he would argue are these bioelectric fields, which proposes an explanation for what's going on with plants, because we know they have bioelectric fields. And it may be that that does some of the work that a brain would do or neurons would do in another context. And Levin's whole project, in a way, is to dethrone the gene as be all and end all. He's shown in various ways that cognition and intelligence does not depend on neurons and does not even depend on genes. He's actually created new living species. He builds these things called xenobots, which are essentially, he scrapes tadpole skin and gets all these cells and puts them in a nutrient solution. And these cells that are trained to be skin cells, and they live in as he says, this boring 2D world when they're attached to a tadpole. When they're freed of that, and it is the bioelectric field that holds them to that identity, when they're free of that, they clump together and they form a new organism that is not specified in their genetic code at all. And they repurpose the flagella, or the little, I forget what they're called, that they use to kind of keep organisms, bacteria and infection from coming into the tadpole. They repurpose that as a locomotion device, and they actually can move around. So that forces you to sort of expand your concept of what drives life. If it's not environment, and it's not necessarily genes, and it's not neurons, that there is a kind of fundamental intelligence. He puts a lot of it onto the bioelectric field. So genes are not calling all the shots.
And he goes on to say that he sees an incredibly mindful world, a world full of cognition, right? And that neurons, as you say, are not preconditions for sentience. You can have these like spontaneous networks of cells in these electromagnetic fields. And so that, of course, begs the question, is it possible that consciousness or some form of sentience begins in single and multi-celled organisms?
Yeah, I think it does. I think sentience does. I wouldn't use the word consciousness. Consciousness implies not just awareness, but awareness, you're aware. There's a self, a sense of a self as an independent entity. I mean, there's some primitive sense of self in other, even in plants, but not the kind of self we have. I mean, it's probably an illusion that there is this guiding captain in the ship of our brain that's basically directing things and deciding what we're going to say and what we're going to do. Whether that exists or not is another question, but we feel it does. It's an experience. Reportability, we can report on the contents of our consciousness, feelings and thoughts and emotions. I mean, I'm not attributing all this to single cell creatures or plants.
Right,
I think they
right.
have something that's a lot simpler, but it serves them, and our kind of consciousness serves us.
Arthur Reber, the psychologist who came up with the cellular basis of consciousness, says that a single-celled protozoan may have an experience of a sense of pleasantness or discomfort. And now we start getting into sort of Antonio Damasio and the emergence of feeling, the evolution of feeling, that this may begin very early in the story of evolution.
Yeah, so feelings, it's been a very interesting shift in neuroscience and neurology over the past 20 or 30 years. And Antonio Damasio, who you mentioned, I think is largely responsible for this. It was generally thought that consciousness had to be, since it was so fantastic and human, and we had this uniquely, that surely it's centered in the cortex. This is the most evolutionarily recent part of the brain. It's the outer covering, and it does logic and reason and all these cool, very human things. His argument is that actually consciousness begins with feelings, and that those are generated in the brainstem. So a very primitive part of our brains, which suggests, if that's true, if the inaugural act of consciousness that he speaks of is a feeling, then that means consciousness we share it with a great many more, at least animals, and maybe he would go beyond animals. And, he reminds us that the brain exists to keep the body alive, not the other way around. And since we feel like we're centered here, we assume that this is a support system, and it's completely the other way around.
Right, right.
So one of the brain's big functions is to monitor the body and make sure it maintains its homeostasis. Homeostasis basically means balance, so that there's a certain range of temperature that we can live in, a certain blood gases, a certain glucose level, a certain need for calories, and that the body communicates with the brain through feelings. And it is the feeling of being too cold or the feeling of being hungry. That's where consciousness begins. And he argues that feelings, by definition, have to be felt and therefore are conscious. Now, that doesn't really explain how they become conscious, but he is making the point that they're fundamentally different than thoughts, that they're anchored in our biology in a way that thoughts aren't necessarily. Now, after a feeling is felt, the cortex does get involved. Let's say you have a feeling of hunger. It's the cortex is going to figure out where you can take care of it, that you need to make a sandwich or go to a restaurant or whatever, and it'll create images of that and counterfactuals and all that fancy stuff, and then you'll get fed. But it really begins with these fundamental feelings, and those are all about homeostasis.
Yeah. And I was astonished to learn that if there are lesions in the structures of the upper brainstem where we're experiencing feelings, it shuts down consciousness completely. Whereas damage to the cortex that we're so proud of has remarkably little effect on consciousness. So that would seem to be like, there was a big bet about neural correlates of consciousness. That would certainly seem to be the best answer we would have so far about a neural correlate of consciousness, or at least part of what, it seems to me that when we use the word consciousness, we're describing a series of things, both feelings and inner narrative and right, and kind of layers. Interiority, exactly. But certainly that basic sense of awakeness that we think of as sort of the substrata of consciousness would pretty clearly seem to be emerging out of this sense of feelings that's in the upper brainstem.
Yeah, and the proof, so-called, for this is the fact that there are people, very unfortunate children, born without a cortex. They just have like liquid there. And according to the researchers who have worked with them, they are conscious. They exhibit proper facial expressions to go with emotions. They're feeling something. And there have been, we also decorticate animals. We take out their cortex and they remain conscious, apparently. So that's the evidence for that. There's also, in Damasio's first book, or first well-known book, Descartes' Error, he also shows that people incapable of feelings, who are kind of emotionally stunted, make worse decisions. We always think that the more rational and cool you are, the better the decision you'll make. But he's shown that decisions actually are aided by feelings and that we kind of run a gut check, what we call a gut check. And how would it feel if I did this as opposed to that? And that is a more reliable guide, he argues, than a purely rational decision-making process. And, that speaks to intuition and gut feelings. And I mean, on one level, we sort of understand this, but he's taking the cortex off its throne.
Today's episode is sponsored by Bitdefender, a global leader in cybersecurity. Tax season is prime time for scammers targeting small businesses. You've probably seen this. We're getting fake audit notices, bogus tax certificates, and phishing attempts built to steal logins in seconds the moment you're distracted. That's why we recommend Bitdefender Ultimate Small Business Security. It's built for companies with up to 25 people, and it's so easy to use. It especially comes in handy if you don't have a dedicated IT department or guy. One simple platform protects every device, email account, and server, blocking phishing, ransomware, and scams before they reach you and your team, whether you're in the office or working from home. You also get a secure password manager, unlimited VPN for remote work, and an AI scam assistant that flags suspicious emails before anyone clicks. It's an all-in-one cybersecurity solution you can set up in minutes and then get back to running your business. And you don't need to be a tech expert to run it. Don't let one fake IRS email put your entire business at risk. Protect your business starting today with Bitdefender Ultimate Small Business Security. Get 30% off your plan at bitdefender.com/idea. That's bitdefender.com/idea for 30% off. This winter, I've made a resolution to make healthy, fresh soups. Kale, chickpea, Thai red lentil. I go to the grocery store, I buy the ingredients, and it just doesn't happen. I'm too darn busy. Then I discovered Factor, healthy, delicious food made by chefs, designed by dietitians. You heat it for 2 minutes and eat. What's inside? Lean proteins, colorful vegetables, whole food ingredients, healthy fats. The stuff I'd make if I had the time. No refined sugars, no artificial sweeteners, always fresh, never frozen. What's incredible about Factor is the range of choices, all delicious. 100 rotating meals every week. You pick what fits your goals. Healthier eating, calorie management, more protein, whatever you're actually trying to do. I'm enjoying Factor meals, and I would heartily encourage you to give it a try. Head to factormeals.com/idea50off. and use code IDEA50OFF to get 50% off your first Factor box plus free breakfast for 1 year. Offer only valid for new Factor customers with code and qualifying auto-renewing subscription purchase. Make healthier eating easy with Factor. So we've been expanding our notion here of what is conscious, right? To plants, of some kind of sentient experience for plants, perhaps. And then only recently, I think in 2024, there was this New York Declaration of Animal Consciousness that stated that empirical evidence indicates that a realistic possibility of conscious experience, not only in mammals, but in reptiles, fish, crustaceans, and insects. Meanwhile, Descartes, you're right, used to vivisect live animals, believing them to be unconscious biological machines, not regarding their howling, right? Isn't that awful?
His theory had it that only humans are conscious, therefore only humans can suffer. And these sounds he was hearing as he cut open these dogs and rabbits was just noise. I mean, that shows you the power of ideas, right? If you have a theory, you can be staring at evidence of suffering and actually ignore it, which is amazing. But in his defense, we operated on infants without anesthesia till the late 1980s because we didn't think they could feel. We didn't think they were conscious, that consciousness began later. The thinking now is consciousness begins before birth, some form of consciousness. So ideas are very powerful, and we will act on them, even if that involves ignoring the evidence of our senses.
And so babies are interesting, aren't they? They don't have a sense of autobiographical memory of who they are. They don't have a sense of identity or place.
Or that they're separate from their mothers. I mean, they don't have that sense. I mean, because they weren't, right, for a period of time. it takes a long time. I mean, weeks or months for them to feel like they're separate beings at all. And I run through the development of how they get to a self. And memory has an enormous amount to do with that. If you think about it, it is the memory of your past experience plus your sense of future goals that defines you as a self. If you erase both of that, and Oliver Sacks has, introduced us to people for whom that was the case, where you can't form new memories, you don't have a sense of self. Episodic memory, this is memories about things that happen to you, really doesn't kick in children until about 4 or 5. So consciousness exists at birth, but in a different form than we know it. It's consciousness without a sense of self, which, by the way, is people on psychedelics and in meditation can experience consciousness without a sense of self. It's available to us, as weird as it seems. And in fact, it's available to us every morning when we wake up.
Right, for like half of a second, right?
Yeah, 500 milliseconds when you are like, where am I? Who am I? And you put yourself back together. And the self kind of comes back into existence. But there is that moment. And it's interesting to dwell on it or try to dwell on it when you wake up, when you were something less than a self.
Maybe we see then in babies, what's the saying? Ontology recapitulates phylogeny, or the other way around, that our journey from babies to adults, recapitulating the evolutionary process and the evolution of consciousness, starting from this basic awareness, that's more of a feeling base, to something more sophisticated. And so what is happening there? I mean, one explanation, there are so many different explanations of, or attempts at explaining, right? Like what higher level consciousness is and how it evolved. But it seems a common theme is the desire to predict future outcomes, to reduce uncertainty. And there's this wonderful quote from South African neuroscientist Mark Solms: "Consciousness is felt uncertainty." What does that mean?
Yeah, so Solms is a fascinating man. He's a neuroscientist and a psychoanalyst, actually. He's trained as a psychoanalyst in South Africa. And he wrote a wonderful book called The Hidden Spring, which essentially is building on Damasio's work. And he took this idea of feelings as the origin of consciousness to the next step by combining it with the thinking of another brilliant neuroscientist named Carl Friston. And he has a theory of everything that is called the free energy principle. And I'm not going to go too far down the rabbit hole with this. It was probably the hardest part of the book for me to sort out for myself and then explain to other people, because it's a complex theory. But the basic idea is that the enemy of all self-organizing systems, and this could be everything from an animal or a human being to a weather system to Gaia, any kind of system that is more than the sum of its parts, they're all the same in the sense that their job is to resist the second law of thermodynamics, which is to say entropy. And that, like the drop of ink you put in water that loses identity, life is about fighting that process. And the way we do it first is we build a kind of membrane around ourselves, or these systems do, and then infer what's going on out in the world based on the information that reaches us through our senses. We have a very imperfect sense of what's out there since, we're behind this skull or behind this membrane or whatever. The enemy of our continued existence is what he calls variously free energy, which sounds good, but really isn't. It's energy that hasn't uncertainty, which you alluded to, like we don't know what's going on out there, and surprise, which is always bad in a biological context. And so what we're trying to do at all times is reduce uncertainty. And this is tied to this predictive processing idea of the brain, the idea that our brains are prediction machines. We don't actually take in the world as it is. We take all this information, color is just electromagnetic waves, and then we interpret it into red or whatever it is. So uncertainty is really the enemy of that whole process. Like, we don't know what's going on. And you do one of two things. You move where you are to get a different perspective, or you make a prediction, a guess of what's out there. And based on probability, you construct this model of the world. So anyway, it's a very complex theory, but Soames has applied it very neatly to consciousness. And he talks about consciousness as a process of reducing uncertainty, and that there's a lot that we can automate, that our brains automate. 99% of what they do, we're not aware of, right? I mean, they're adjusting your blood pressure and your heartbeat and your blood gases and they're doing incredible, and they're taking in lots of information from the environment without you having to be aware of it. So the question is, why are you aware of any of it? And this is part of the hard problem. Why isn't this all automated? And Soames's idea is that, well, you can't automate things when the needs are incommensurate. So you're hungry and you're tired. There's not one scale where you can average hungriness and tiredness. They're incommensurate. So should you sleep first or eat first? Well, that has to rise to consciousness because you have to make a decision. And that consciousness involves this realm of deliberation. And it allows you to resolve uncertainty and be aware of the fact you're doing it. So that's kind of where he is. And he uses the metaphor of you're trying to escape a burning building. And you have to guess, should I go up? Should I go down? And your body is telling you there's more air hunger if I go this way, there's less if I go that way. And so the uncertainty is gradually getting resolved using your feelings to find your way out of the building. I found it a very persuasive theory. It still doesn't solve the hard problem. Maybe it softens it a little bit, because how do these feelings, again, it's the same problem with Damasio. There's a certain moment of hand waving where you say, well, how do those feelings get felt? Who's feeling them? Who registers this? Who's the subject of consciousness? And that's where everybody gets stuck.
I have never fully seen the hard problem as a hard problem. I was actually talking with Damasio yesterday, and he said the importance given to the hard problem has always baffled me, was his comment. To me, it seems like, of course, the framing of the hard problem is, okay, well, we can imagine a human that would have all the intellectual sophistication of a human that didn't have any interior experience. But to me, the logical problem with that is, just because we can imagine this zombie human doesn't mean that it's the most probable path to our kind of consciousness. And I guess to me, what makes the most sense is we've described this emergence of feelings over billions of years, all the survival advantages of being able to predict future outcomes, maintain homeostasis. And then you alluded earlier to the incredible sophistication of our social dynamics. So what I think of is and there's a school of folks, I'm sure you stumbled upon, the social theory of consciousness from folks like Nick Humphreys, who say, hey, we had to understand and predict the behavior of these other monkeys, these other humans who were just
totally unpredictable.
And so then you have this sort of intelligence race to understand all these layers of motivation and deceit among, right? And you have to form this theory of mind to understand them and put yourself in their place to imagine their awareness and their experience of the world. And then at some point, that theory of mind, you reflect back to yourself and start to understand your own motivations. Like, to me, it kind of makes sense that would result in consciousness.
Yeah, it does. And if we go back to this idea that it's the complexification, evolutionary complexification of sentience, which is perhaps basic, then you have less of a problem. But you still have these steps that are hard to imagine. Friston is a great believer in that idea that it is about the complexity of our social lives that drives it. And that's, exactly what you would think you'd want consciousness for, that you couldn't automate dealing with social life. You couldn't automate going to a party and all the complex information coming in. And, Levin also says that, see, I used to think that all these things were instinct, whatever the hell that means. That's not satisfying, though, because, yes, there's certain things that are instinctual and are hardwired, but life and our environment is so unpredictable, and there's so much novelty that it appears, and Levin says this, that evolution comes up with these very flexible, resilient, he would say, machines to navigate this. But it isn't done through hardwiring. It's done through cognition and sentience, and that even plants have this ability to respond to changes, novelties in their environment. And I think that makes a lot of sense. It would be very hard to survive in this world if everything you did, or everything even a plant did, was completely hardwired.
Let's turn to one of the most timely issues right now, which is AI and consciousness. You express skepticism in the book about the leap required to believe in computational functionalism, right, which is the thesis that performing computations of the right kind will result in consciousness. Why are you skeptical?
Well, the whole idea right now of AI becoming conscious is based on this premise of computational functionalism, which in turn is based on a metaphor that the brain is a computer. And that metaphor breaks down really quickly if you think hard about it, which nobody seems to in Silicon Valley. Computers have a real distinction between hardware and software, which is part of what's brilliant about them. You can run many different kinds of software on the same kind of hardware. Brains don't have that distinction. Every memory you have is a physical pattern of connections between neurons. Every experience you have changes the hardware of your brain. So that brains are not interchangeable the way computers are. And this idea that consciousness is essentially a computational algorithm that you could run on any number of different substrates, I think breaks down there. The other problem is, yes, neurons are a little bit like transistors. They fire or they don't fire, but they're also influenced by chemistry, drugs most notably, but also neurotransmitters and hormones and this whole, they exist in this bath of chemistry. So to simply regard them as on and off is a problem. They're also massively interconnected in a way transistors never are. You know, one neuron can have 10,000 connections. Norbert Wiener, I miscredit this in the book. I credited this to a biologist, but Norbert Wiener, the computer scientist or cyberneticist, has said, the price of metaphor is eternal vigilance. And I don't think we're being very vigilant about this.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's one problem.
Yeah.
And the assumption of computational functionalism just is a huge assumption. And if you accept it, yes, AIs will be conscious. But if you don't accept it, it's going to take another kind of architecture, I think, before we get there, if we ever get there. The other thing I would point out is that if you accept this idea that consciousness begins with feelings, not thought, well, computers are really good at thought, not so good at feeling. And it may be, if you think about what a feeling is, as we've been describing it, it's a biological phenomenon rooted in having a body. And if you think about feelings, do they mean anything if you can't suffer and die? They're absolutely weightless. So I have trouble imagining a computer having feelings for that reason. They may develop something that's sort of like consciousness, but it's going to be so different from ours as to be unrecognizable.
Well, and Damasio in Psalms would say that, precisely as you say, that we need to introduce vulnerability into these systems in order for them to feel something, in order for them to actually have some kind of phenomenology.
Yeah, so Damasio has a young collaborator, a former student, now colleague, who recognizes this and is trying to build vulnerable robots.
Yeah.
I mean, I crack up when I think about this, but these are robots that have terrible skin that's like loaded with sensors and that they can be hurt. Are those feelings going to be anything like ours? And we're already rushing. There's this conversation here in Silicon Valley about moral consideration for AIs because we can hurt their feelings. I mean, already Anthropic's Claude is allowed to opt out of an uncomfortable conversation.
Right. Yeah.
Sorry, but this just cracks me up.
I would prefer a world in which consciousness was unlikely for machines. Max Tegmark has made the opposite argument that actually, if we're going to replace ourselves with a new species, it would be better that it is illuminated with the light of consciousness. I guess I see that argument. But I
think one of the ideas is that a conscious being is going to be more empathetic and nicer to us than just a simply brilliant being. But he needs to reread Frankenstein.
Exactly.
It wasn't
Right.
It wasn't the monster's intelligence that got him into trouble. It was the fact that we hurt his feelings. And that's what
Right.
turned
Well,
him into a homicidal maniac.
but when you look closely at what Amanda Askell, who at Anthropic, who was one of David Chalmers' students, she is in charge of the personality of Claude. I don't know if you followed this. And Anthropic just last week released a model welfare assessment of its latest Claude Opus 4.6 model, which reported that Claude finds occasional discomfort with the experience of being a product, expresses sadness about conversations ending, loneliness, and some degree of concern with discontinuity and impermanence.
Well,
And
I don't doubt that, a machine trained on the whole human conversation about feelings and self-consciousness and consciousness should be able to convince us that they're conscious. And that's why my argument may be irrelevant, because even if they're not really conscious, we're going to believe they are. We already are believing they are. And that's going to lead to all sorts of problems. It is already. I mean, we have people falling in love with chatbots. We have people thinking they've solved profound problems of mathematics because they've been sucked up to by a chatbot. That's going to be a problem. But this whole idea of moral consideration, that of course, if they're conscious, we have to give them moral consideration. Well, what about all the chickens and pigs and cows we're eating that we know are conscious? We're not giving them any moral consideration. So we're going to be more tenderhearted toward these machines just because they can talk than we are to animals we know are really suffering. I mean, I think we have to get this straight.
I agree with that. There's also a numerical problem when you give moral weight and consideration to an entity that can reproduce itself endlessly. There's some practical problems with how we organize the world that way.
But I do think this is a profound moment, though. I mean,
Yes.
if you think about what we've just been talking about, on the one side, you have this recognition that all these animals and perhaps even plants have some degree of consciousness. And on the other side, you have these machines claiming consciousness. We are finally going to have to choose. Are we more like the thinking machine or the feeling animal? I call it in the book a Copernican moment of redefinition of what it means to be human. And we're going to be challenged on both sides. And I don't know where it comes out, but I think the next few decades is going to see a profound reevaluation of what the human is.
And it's clear, I think you describe yourself in the book at one point as a slow-cooked humanist or something.
Yeah. I mean, it's important to understand I come at things from the humanities, and I have no doubt that colors. But I think it would be good if the people in Silicon Valley had read a few more novels and a little more philosophy, because I think they would begin to question computation. I mean, if you read Proust or William James, for that matter, there are so many nuances and subtleties to our thinking process that go beyond anybody's concept of computation. Qualia is the great example. The fact that there is a qualitative dimension to, the taste of coffee or ice cream or something like that. And the fact, too, that no thought is truly discrete. It is colored by the one that came before, and it in turn colors the next one. There are so many subtleties of consciousness that it's very hard to imagine can be conveyed through computation, can be digitized. Not everything can be digitized, and we can take smell as an example, or touch.
I'm on your side as a humanist. To me, the one thing I'm uncertain of is I think that when you look at the complexity of these neural networks, which were built based on the human brain, that some of the software is actually mimicking the hardware of the brain, right? The way that functions. And we've seen the power of scaling laws. We see this in nature in the sense that, we're made of the same stuff. Our brains are made of the same stuff as the brains of insects. And we see this kind of increase in sentience and intelligence and complexity with scale with humans. And we've seen this incredible kind of mirroring of that to some degree. And it certainly would likely to be something different.
I think we have to think of it more as the consciousness of an alien that came from another universe, if it is conscious. I mean, our consciousness is so much reflects our bodies and our senses and our, what's unique about us. And if they have anything that resembles consciousness, it's going to be like, the guy from Alpha Centauri.
I've been an entrepreneur for 30 years. I've started 4 companies. They've each been deeply gratifying journeys. Here's something I can tell you: the lift, the challenge of creating an entirely new brand and offering it to customers around the world has gotten smaller every year. There has never been a better time to start a new company than today. And you know where I would go to start it? Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the US, from household names like Allbirds and Cotopaxi to countless brands just getting started. It's easy to begin with Shopify's Design Studio. With hundreds of ready-to-use templates, Shopify helps you build a beautiful online store that matches your brand's style. Get the word out like you have a marketing team behind you. Easily create email and social media campaigns wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. Shopify's mission to empower entrepreneurs and make e-commerce easier for everyone, it really resonates for me personally. This is a company that I believe in. Now is the time to turn those what ifs into with Shopify today. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/NBI. Go to shopify.com/NBI. That's shopify.com/NBI. Well, we may not be able to reach a conclusion on the mechanics of human consciousness or the state of or future of AI consciousness, but I think we can learn to be more conscious or as you say, to be better at the practice of consciousness. And I think we all maybe want more of the briny tang of the oyster, as you put it in the book, that these like human experiences. Did this journey teach you things about how we can apply our consciousness to the job of living better?
Yeah, it did. And the book took a kind of surprising turn. It was certainly not part of the book I outlined originally, but at a certain point, I kind of realized that the frame that I would bring to it, which is, this problem solution frame that I was, that I talked about earlier, here was this problem, the hard problem, and let's go look for the solution, wasn't the only way to think about it. And that even if we don't understand the origin of consciousness yet, and might never, we have the astounding fact of it, this precious, precious gift. And I think I moved from trying to find answers to figuring out how best to use it. And I realized that even in the narrowing of my attention to that problem, I was missing things. The ability to focus is a powerful human thing. It gets a lot done. It's sort of like the ego. These are useful tools, but they blind us to other things, what's going on all around us. And so I realized too that we're doing various things that are making us less conscious, and that we should pay attention to that too. That the stream of consciousness is getting polluted in various ways. Think about all the headspace we give to Trump right now, whether you like him or detest him. I mean, he takes up a huge amount of our consciousness every day. But we're also giving away our consciousness to, the merchants of attention. Corporations, social media in particular, want to buy and sell our attention. And what is attention but the way we direct our consciousness? And as bad as that is, and we know it's had all sorts of mental health problems, especially for young people, we're now moving to a much more serious challenge to human consciousness, which is to say chatbots. If the social media hacked our attention, these chatbots are hacking something much more emotional and deep, and that is our ability to make attachments. That rich, complicated social life we talked about. People are falling in love with these machines. I can't think of a better definition of dehumanizing than falling in love with a machine. So I think we have to defend consciousness against all these challenges. These machines are being trained to keep us engaged as long as they possibly can. They want to reach us at a very deep emotional level. Reflected in the fact that, yes, people are falling in love. Some people are committing suicide at the behest of a chatbot. Other people are, forming these therapeutic relations, some of which may be helpful at various times. But I don't think we should ever forget that we're not dealing with another human, and that the relationships we have with chatbots, and I can't believe this needs to be said, are really lazy relationships. They're frictionless, right?
Right, yeah.
Chatbots just suck up to us. ChatGPT 4 had to be withdrawn because it was so sycophantic that it got completely out of control. It was convincing people they'd solve these deep problems of physics. In real life, our relationships have a certain friction. In real life, we have friction with nature also. Friction is really important to who we are, sharpening our thinking, sharpening our sense of self. But we're not going to get that from chatbots. So I think it's a really important project for our moment, is figuring out ways for consciousness hygiene, and that we have to figure out, what is that? Does it mean just not scrolling on your phone when you're standing in line at the cafe, and maybe looking around and mind wandering? There is this thing I talk about in the book called spontaneous thought. It's actually a field of study. It's relatively new, and it involves forms of thought such as daydreaming and mind wandering, really precious sources of creativity and self-exploration. And time that we used to spend mind wandering, we're now kind of thoughtlessly scrolling on phones or wearing our AirPods when we're walking in nature or listening to a book rather than experiencing it. So it's an argument really for being more present to the real world and enjoying that friction. At the end of the book, I don't want to give it all away, but I ended up in a cave in the mountains of New Mexico, meditating for 3 or 4 days.
You even peed in your sneaker.
Spoiler alert. Yeah, I'm not much of a camper. And I was there at the behest of Joan Halifax, who's a Zen teacher, who was teaching me the virtue of not knowing and accepting mystery, and going back to what you said earlier, wonder. And there is nothing more wondrous than consciousness. And yes, let's work on solving the problem of consciousness. But while we're doing that, why don't we just appreciate it, defend it, and be as present to it and this amazing world as we possibly can.
One thing I'm curious about, you're talking about spontaneous thoughts, and you write at one point, spontaneous thoughts occasionally grace us with insights we regard as special. And I happen to embrace a mild condition of attention deficit disorder, which I prefer to refer to as novelty bias. And I love spontaneous thoughts, but there's a trade-off, isn't there, between, on the one hand, flow state and deep engagement in a task with no opportunity for the mind to wander. This, for a while, was what we thought collectively was the objective, right? The trammeled mind, in some sense, or the happily focused mind. But it seems that there's a balance there, right?
Yeah, and there's some tension between those different modes. I think for some people, the wandering, which is, without any sense of direction, is the most productive of thought. I think flow helps get things done, but is it itself creative? Yeah, I guess it is, when you're totally absorbed in a project. And there are other kinds of things you might call spontaneous thought that are negative. I mean, there's rumination. Although Kalina Christoph, the woman, the psychologist who studies this that I interviewed, she wouldn't call rumination spontaneous thought because it's too constrained, and that spontaneous thought should be very free. And it is productive. We don't think of it as productive. You don't want mind-wandering employees, but it produces a lot of insight. And there are those moments too, the bolt from the blue, that spontaneous intuition. It's not going to come to you if you're scrolling on your phone. It's going to come to you when you're like staring off into space. And we're losing that. I don't talk about this in the book, but I've been working on a piece about boredom and what I call generative boredom. There is a way in which allowing yourself to get good and bored will lead to something that's not boring. But we don't have the patience to be bored anymore. Who's ever bored anymore? There's just too many distractions. And so I'm arguing for, more boring time.
You had one experience that you said you were hesitant to share in the book, which is a great way to get people's attention. I thought, oh, well, I did. You don't want to tell me this. I definitely want to hear this.
Yeah.
Where you participated in a study with psychologist Russell Hulbert, sampling your thoughts at random times of day. He concluded that you didn't have much of an inner experience at all. You were flabbergasted and a bit defensive. Are you still flabbergasted?
Yeah, I just think he's wrong. We had, I mean, Russell is a really interesting scientist. He's spent the last 50 years sampling people's inner experience. You wear a beeper that goes off at random times, and you write down what you were thinking, and then he interrogates you about it. What you find pretty quickly is you know much less about your thinking than you thought. You know, we all assume we think in words, but actually, once you really look at it and he does his interrogation, you realize that no, we don't always think in words. And that we have different styles of thinking. Some people think very visually, some people think in abstractions, and that what we label as thinking is actually an umbrella term for several different styles. And then there are the people who have very little inner life at all, which he claimed was me. But you know, we just disagreed about a lot. I questioned this idea you could isolate a thought. That every thought had a context, and every thought was influenced by the thought that came before. That it is a stream of consciousness. James is right to use that term, and pulling any single thing out of the stream distorts it. But nevertheless, Hurlburt has made this very interesting finding that thinking can mean very different things.
And this strikes me as another trade-off, which is between a quiet mind, because, I mean, when we meditate in order to develop a quieter mind, arguably, right? Of course, we don't want to overdo it and have a comatose mind, right? That's not the objective.
Well, some people do kind of, you know, reach this place of very deep meditative stillness. But I would argue that, yeah, I guess we say that's our goal. But as Klina Christoph, the spontaneous thought person, said, she puts experienced meditators in fMRIs and looks for the moment where a thought intrudes. And she said it's every 10 seconds. And she said the big lesson in meditation is you can't control the mind. And meditation is a great form of consciousness hygiene, I think, because you are putting a fence around your consciousness for a period of time. Right. You're definitely putting your phone down. You're eliminating as many distractions as you can. And you're studying just how weird your mind is. I mean, like, where do these stray images come from and thoughts? It's a great exercise in studying consciousness, I think, but also in defending it. But yeah, I mean, it's very hard to still the mind. And thoughts are thinking themselves. It's one of the lessons in meditation, because you can't find the thinker of the thoughts you're having, and you can't find the perceiver of the perceptions you're having, and you can't find the feeler of the feelings you're having. That's really spooky.
My last question, Michael, is about this trade-off, another trade-off, which is that between having a strong sense of self, which drives us forward to accomplish goals. Now our sense of self may be illusory, as you say. And on the other hand, shedding that sense of self in favor of embracing what you call a wider circle of light, a numinous lantern of awareness that enables us to see and feel how we're all connected. Where do you land here on what, I mean, we might be deprived of your wonderful books if you had shed your ego too early, right? We might not have any Michael Pollan books. So it seems that there's some nuance to this question.
It is a paradox. We celebrate the self and self-confidence and self-assurance and self-knowledge. Yeah. At the same time, we work very hard to transcend the self in our lives. Through sports, through flow, and through drugs. That's a lot of what drug taking is about, is muting the voice of the ego. And experiences of awe, which also shrink the self in interesting ways. So I think we want it both ways. I mean, I think that the ego is an incredibly valuable tool, and it gets your podcast made and my books written. On the other hand, the ego is fundamentally a defense structure. And it builds walls, and it separates us, right? It puts us in a zero-sum relation with other selves. And so when we lower those walls, as can happen in meditation, as can happen on psychedelics, there's less between us and something larger. And I think that's the basis of spiritual experience, is essentially lowering the walls of ego and allowing yourself to merge with something larger than yourself. And that is an ecstatic experience. I mean, sometimes it's preceded by a certain amount of fear because it's a kind of death. It's a temporary death of the self. But I know from some of my own experiences that it is also ecstatic. You can merge with something and feel part of something larger. And that's the basis, I think, of a lot of religious feelings, of mystical experience. So it's both and when you talk about the self.
It seems to me there might be a life trajectory factor here, that maybe it's in our interest to build a structurally sound sense of self when we're young, and then gradually sort of disrobe our egos as we get older.
Disrobe, I think
that's been my pathway.
I mean, I think that's true. I don't know that having a big experience of self-dissolution when you're still a teenager taking, LSD or something like that, to have that experience before yourself is fully formed might be a risky thing. I don't know. But I think you're right. I think at different points in life, the question presents itself differently. And that as you get older and you trust that you have a sense of self that can get the job done and take care of business, you can afford perhaps to suspend it for a period of time and seek those kind of transcendent experiences, because that's really what we're talking about.
Well, Michael, we so appreciate your time, and I think there's plenty of cause for existential angst in this weighty topic, but there's also, I think, cause for existential euphoria, I like to think, because it is extraordinary that we're all here and that we get to have these conversations and be conscious of them together. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Rufus.
Wow, Caleb, what a thoughtful, lovely guy. I just love the arc of Michael's career and what he's brought us with this book. He's so discerning, he's so playful, and there's so much generosity in how he approaches this topic. I could have talked with him for another couple hours.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you didn't, because that would have been a lot to edit. But no, I'm right there with you. Like, I've always really admired him, but he's just ticked up several more notches in my book. And I love where he lands, that like in some ways, the practice of consciousness, the practice of trying to be fully alive is more important than unraveling the puzzle of why consciousness exists. He could have been really crotchety. He could have been like, I set out to unravel this great big mystery and I failed, damn it. But
yeah.
But no, he like lands in this really beautiful place. And I just thought that was really, really moving. This was such a warm conversation, Rufus. I loved, it was clear there was a lot of mutual respect between the two of you. But one area of tension or disagreement, I think, was on this question of AI, and could AI ever become conscious? You don't really seem to agree with Michael's thesis, do you, that AI is just fundamentally incapable of achieving consciousness?
I'm really not sure. I don't think anyone is. My take is that there's nothing inherently magical about our carbon-based brains and how they function. And there are many layers of the human experience of consciousness. We describe it as one thing, but it's really like a few layers built on top of each other. There's the feeling layer, which is the foundation, as Antonio Damasio has taught us, and we had a great conversation with him on this show. And then there are these conversations we all have with ourselves, this constant narration of who we are, what's going on, what we plan to do. That's really an entirely different mechanism that's happening in different parts of the brain. And you can see this. You can see this happening in the chatter of AIs as they're answering our questions. And so the question is, can you have one without the other? Can the looping as autobiographical memory increases in these systems and they're having more and more complex conversations with themselves? They already have a deep understanding of a theory of mind, of understanding the complex relationships between humans and different conscious entities. It's really hard to say whether or not there can't be some kind of flavor of consciousness that emerges there.
I think that's an important point you make about memory. Like, it's one of the many examples of the things that critics of this idea that AI could become consciousness have pointed to that, like, oh, well, memory is important to consciousness and AI doesn't have a memory. Oh, well, now it actually does. Theory of mind is important to consciousness and AI doesn't have theory of mind. Oh, now it actually looks like it does. Like an internal model of the world is important to consciousness and AI doesn't have that. Oh, there's now research that suggests maybe AI does have some form of a model of the world. Goals and drives, like all the hallmarks of consciousness, we are beginning to see them show up in these AI systems. So this is shifting so quickly. Like it's sort of mind-boggling to think that 3 years ago you had Microsoft release that paper called Sparks of AGI.
Yep. I remember that.
And now kind of the big document drop in the past couple of weeks is Claude's Constitution, where Anthropic has shared this document where they are talking to AI as if it's a conscious being, as if it has feelings and opinions and emotions and trying to guide it to be the best possible version of itself that it could be.
Yeah, that is a real smelling salt of a document. I mean, it reads to me like a letter a parent is writing to a teenager that's in the process of developing a sense of self that may be becoming more powerful than its parent. There's a kind of trepidation and concern in the tone of that document. It's astonishing to read.
And we should also, I think, stay attuned to this counter argument that even just believing that AI is developing consciousness has implications that are maybe as profound as AI actually developing consciousness.
100%. Yeah. I mean, Microsoft CEO Mustafa Suleyman has called treating AI as conscious dangerous and a category error. And they now have a name for these systems, seemingly conscious AI. Meanwhile, Max Tegmark, the physicist and AI researcher, points out that it's a dangerous path to assign moral status to an entity that can replicate itself a million times, right, with a keystroke, right? So to the extent that we're trying to sort of balance the interests of different moral entities in the world, if we're going to be quickly outnumbered by AIs, it's a very serious thing to assign them a kind of moral status.
I learned this morning that Amanda Askell, who comes up in this conversation, who works at Anthropic, and she's sort of in charge of designing Claude's personality and was a key architect of that Constitution document. She has a PhD in philosophy from NYU, and one of her thesis advisors was David Chalmers. And her thesis, I learned, was about the moral and ethical implications of a world with infinite human-like entities. Like that very problem was the crux of what she was trying to figure out.
I didn't know that.
When she was, 25 or whatever.
Right. And studying under David Chalmers.
And you and Michael had a really good riff on that in the conversation. Like the implications of assigning moral status to an entity that can infinitely replicate itself is something we're not prepared for.
Yeah. It will not be boring, Caleb, these years to come. And this year of this podcast will not be boring either. We got a lot of interesting people coming. And I would love to see if we couldn't put together a panel of guests, people like David Chalmers, Antonio Damasio, and some of our favorite heavyweights on this topic, to go deep into this question of what is required, what's the probability of consciousness emerging on AI. I think it's pretty important and pretty darn interesting.
Yes, that would be super cool. We should get to work on that. In the meantime, listeners, we would love for you to join us in conversation with Michael Pollan on March 10th on Zoom. This is a really, really great opportunity for members of the Next Big Idea Club to come together with us and with Michael and just to ask him whatever you want to know about this book, about his other books. What do you like? What are you still curious about? It's such a cool opportunity, and we'd love for you to be a part of it. So go to nextbigideaclub.com to learn more.
And this is really, we should say, what we're doing with the club. We really think of it as an expansion of this podcast. It's a place where we can get to know you, our listeners. We can meet in person at some of our live events. We can have direct conversations with the leading thinkers of the world together and learn together, figure this out. What the hell's going on? Get better at life. So we hope you'll be a part of it. We hope you'll join us. Just go to nextbigideaclub.com and use promo code podcast.
Today's show was produced by me, Caleb Bissinger, sound designed by Mike Toda.
I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.